We're beaming to you live from Ojai Valley Community Church in Southern California. This is not the first webinar we've done from this space. We are amidst a 17-day Permaculture Design Certificate course as part of the Bartimaeus Institute educational series, and tonight's webinar is an opportunity for those of you from around North America to get a glimpse into what has been a very exciting, exhausting, rich time of intensive training in permaculture design. This is, as far as we know, the first or one of the first permaculture design courses ever to be held that attempts to integrate in Christian theology and practices, and so it's been a really rich interweaving of those two things. And to my left, in the center of your screen, are our two primary instructors, Chris Grataski here. Some of you have seen Chris before on these webinars. And Sylvia Keesmaat, who has tuned into webinars before, but I believe this is her first time to be on this side of the camera. Sylvia is from Ontario, Canada. Chris from near Lynchburg, Virginia. And they've been hard at it. We are 12 days in?
I think so.
12 out of 17 days is by far the longest institute we've ever attempted. And sitting around us, which you out there in Radioland can't see, is our intrepid class, including a few. Oh, do you want to start panning? I was going to actually ask you. Tim is going to pan our webinar, so to speak. Here goes the camera. Try not to get seasick. A couple of guests, Charlita and Jen. Why don't everybody just introduce themselves, since we're going to the trouble. I think the mic will pick it up if you speak loudly.
You can repeat it.
It's okay, Tim.
Well, if you can hear me, I'm Chris. I'm actually Chris White. I'm the one who usually sends you the wrong information about when to log on to the webinar. So, yeah, I'm enjoying the PDC a lot.
All right, so that's Chris.
I'm Jeremy Braxton from Fresno, California.
Say hi to your wife, Jeremy.
Hi, Kim.
We've got several spouses and partners of people on the webinar, and this is the first glimpse you're having of your partner in 12 days. Go ahead, Mark.
Hi, my name is Mark Heisey. I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and currently living in San Jose, Costa Rica.
I'm Jean Brown, and I'm here from Germantown, Maryland, which is just north of Washington, D.C., on behalf of BCM Church.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mom and Dad. I'm Zachary Kovich from Cleveland, Ohio area, but most recently Fresno, California.
Lauren Johnson from Leavenworth, Washington.
And behind Lauren is Raquel Jensen, who is both a PDC participant and the chief cook, along with Chris White, who have done an amazing job cooking for this gaggle of people. Let's give them a hand. Woo!
I'm Julia Baker, currently living in Fresno, California.
That would be Julia Baker with a very soft voice. And I think your dad is possibly on this. Sylvia, or Miriam.
Hi, I'm both here. My name is Miriam Maldonado, and I come from Mexico, and we have a ministry of community garden, and it's located in Dallas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, right on the border.
I'm John McRae. I'm from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia.
All right, some of these folks will have an opportunity to hear more from in the course of this webinar. but we've got about a dozen folks who are taking this 17-day course. It's a big deal, and yet, Chris, the Permaculture Design Certificate course is a international standard, internationally recognized, been around for a while. Maybe you could orient our friends on the webinar a little bit about what permaculture is and how the permaculture design course has really spread over the last quarter century into a really important movement around the world.
Yeah, sure. So permaculture is an ecological design discipline concerned with the cultivation of high biodiversity human habitats where the human community is harmoniously reintegrated into the wild landscape, where all the human community's needs and dreams are met through serving the needs and inclinations of the landscape, the non-human landscape. So that's quite a mouthful. Another way of looking at it is that it's an ecological design discipline that marries the commitments and the discipline of wildland restoration, habitat restoration on one hand, and on the other hand, the commitments and disciplines of food production that are historically associated with agriculture or horticulture. So it's in many ways quite sophisticated, but at the same time, it's really a discipline of common sense. It's a discipline that invites us to listen to the patterns and processes of wild landscapes and to try and re-inhabit our watersheds in a variety of ways where our needs and our desires no longer run roughshod over creation, but instead where our communities can become lovingly and peacefully nested within God's creation. The Permaculture Design Certification course is a minimum of 72 curriculum hours, and it's a course that emerged in the 1970s, and it's usually a 10 to 14 day and oftentimes 3-week class that is a class on applied ecology, really inviting participants to learn to look deeply at landscape, to read landscapes, to understand the patterns and processes that we are, whether we know it or not, embedded within and dependent upon, and how to participate in those patterns and processes in a way where we sort of recover our creaturehood, our creaturely identity. So instead of studying the water cycle in an abstract kind of way, we're studying the water cycle and asking the question, how do we become active participants in the water cycle?
Why is permaculture so popular all around the world? It's something that a lot of folks, Chris, of your generation have been curious about. What is it, why is it resonating so strongly? What is it trying to address in terms of our historic crisis?
Yeah. Well, on one hand, I think people are waking up to the fact that we stand at a crossroads, and that crossroads is characterized by the intersecting crises of our time, two of which, more ecologically speaking, are the challenge of climate change and peak energy, or the increasing threat of major shifts that will occur as we encounter increasing resource scarcity and having to transition into new forms of energy use. So people are aware of that, but there's also a significant connection that people are making between the social problems that mark our time and what we think of as these ecological problems, and people are beginning to see that these are they're interconnected. And I think for a long time, or I should say it this way, one of the things I hear in the permaculture community a lot is that people are drawn to permaculture because it gives us something to do and helps us think through what we stand for, not just what we stand against, but it's a solutions-based approach on a small scale, what we can do in our communities at the level of the neighborhood, the homestead, the municipality, the bioregion that we live in.
Sylvia Keesmaat is a farmer who's interested in permaculture, and she is both a teacher in this course and a participant in this course. Sylvia is an old friend. She is a Bible geek like me, except she's a bona fide biblical scholar, who actually has made choices to farm rather than to teach full-time in the academy. There aren't too many people out there who can make that claim, and it's one of the reasons why we have so much respect for her, because she continues to work her craft as a biblical scholar while and a servant of the church, while at the same time working a homestead in Ontario, northeast of Toronto. So Sylvia, welcome, and
Thanks.
Thanks for being in on this. First of all, let me ask you about your journey as a farmer, because I know that it has been quite a journey till now. How did you get to Russet House Farm, and what is Russet House Farm?
I'll start with your second question. Russet House Farm is a 50-acre farm in Canada. It's 35 acres of bush, cedar, and maple, and 15 acres of house and garden and prairie pasture and hayfield. And we have rare breed cattle and horses and ducks and chickens and dogs and more cats than we can count right now. And we ended up on Russet House Farm largely because as my husband Brian and I were doing more work with the biblical text and doing a lot of teaching about the biblical story, we started to realize that this is a story deeply embedded in the land, in creation. A story that's about our calling as image bearers to care for creation, and a story that tells us again and again that the fate of human beings as image bearers is tied in with care and affection for the land, and faithfulness to the land, commitment to the land. And so when the opportunity came up to move to Russet House Farm, we waited to see if the land was calling us. And after we'd gone to the place and seen it, we felt as though the land was indeed calling us. And that's when we began to pray about this decision and discern whether we should move there. I should also add that in our life at that time, and still in our life, was the son of friends whom we bought the farm with initially, who had special needs. And we saw this farm, this place in creation, as a place where that young man could find a home, where his abilities could be honored, and where he could develop his own gifts and skills. So the farm was tied in as a place of healing for somebody vulnerable in our community as well.
I'm curious, you were doing regular teaching at several places in Toronto. How did your colleagues look upon your decision to put your weight on the foot that is on the farm, even though you keep a foot still there in the academy and in the church? How did that go over, and what were some of the reasons for that?
Well, some of the reasons were, and I'll tell you how it went over. Some of the reasons were that the more immersed I became in the biblical story, the more it became clear that this was a book about the health of community and the health of the earth and the health of the community which we find around ourselves. And in full-time academia, there's not a lot of time for community. It can be a hard slog, and it's hard to be there to care for the people and places that you want to care for. And so it became pretty clear that in order to actually be a part of a community, to care for a place, being full-time in the academy wouldn't work. And partly because that's not the focus of biblical scholarship either. I would have had to keep reading in certain areas if I'd wanted to keep on that track. I think by and large, people, my colleagues thought I was just a little weird for doing this, particularly since I just got tenure. So kind of gave up tenure, and now I think there's certainly a sense that this is a real good way to kill your career, giving up on that career track, academic life. On the other hand, not being in academia enables me to actually teach the Bible in all kinds of contexts that I wouldn't have had time for before, and that's really important as well. So
in the background, you can see Sylvia's been working for 10 days on building out the big biblical story and its relevance to all the themes that are being covered in this permaculture design course. Sylvia, you continue to write as a theologian and publish, so you very much have a foot in that world, and yet your perspective now is truly shaped by the soil, by the discipline of growing. What are two things you've learned theologically through your work on the land that you didn't know before? I know there are many, so I'm just
two things I've learned theologically. One thing I learned theologically is where life is shaped. So it became clear to me after a few years that when I plant seeds in the greenhouse, this is where my seeds want to be born. There's warmth and nurture and water and life and the conversations of children. And that started me thinking about the biblical story, which is all about seeds at the beginning and what kind of a world those seeds are brought forth in. And so from that perspective, I started thinking, how does this story talk about the creation in which seeds find their home? Seeds as our food supply, seeds as the food supply for all creatures, seeds as not just food supply, but the source of all living around us that provide us with shelter and clothing and everything. So just sort of thinking, comparing what that picture looked like in the biblical story and the context in which we grow seeds in our world. What a stark contrast that is. And so that was one thing, just sort of working with the soil made me read the text differently, and then that brought me to a different way of thinking about the narrative of planting and seeds in our world. That's one thing. I think the other thing that I've learned working with the land and in this one place is that those parts of the biblical story that talk about creation and then talk about land are not the only parts of the story that relate to how we live in the earth, to how we live with each other. So even a text like, say, the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 6, which we tend to think about, these are kind of spiritual fruits, right? Love, joy, peace, compassion, patience, faithfulness, self-control. There's probably another one. There's one more. We tend to think of those are kind of spiritual virtues. But if you're living in a particular place to which you're committed, you start to ask yourself, what do those things look like on the ground, rooted in this place? What does it look like to practice patience in relation to this piece of land? And self-control in relations to this piece of land? And joy, to have joy in this piece of land? And faithfulness, to be committed to where I am right now. So just kind of rethinking not only the text about creation and land and water and trees, but also everything the Bible says about how we live in the world in relation to this place. that's been a new insight from being involved with the place.
Galatians 6 is a food forest.
Yeah, it's actually Galatians 5.
5 is a
Yeah,
food
sorry,
forest.
I said it wrong. Yes, food forest. All those fruit.
Chris, I want to ask you the same question. I know even though you are a professional permaculturist, somebody who's decided to make a career out of this, you also are very much theologically literate and concerned and involved, and you've been in and are in a lot of theological conversations. And I know permaculture has taught you a lot and given you a lot of perspective on faith and theology, and I'm wondering if you could just identify two ways of the many, many ways in which the art and discipline of permaculture are helping you think differently theologically.
Mm-hmm. Well, for when I first got interested in seeing and being committed to the healing of the wounds of the earth, my first introduction to a lot of that was in pretty standard conservation and preservation approaches to healing landscape. But the further in I went in my study, the more I realized that it wasn't the removal of humans from ecosystems that would lead to their regeneration, but it was through humans taking up once again an appropriate relationship with their land base and watershed. So what Kat Anderson, the ethnobotanist, refers to as tending the wild. And I think in Philippians 2, where we hear that we are to take the posture of Jesus and inhabit this sort of self-giving posture of relationship to those around us, that I think we hear that full humanness consists of existing for the flourishing of others. And there's a deep ecological reality there, that if we take on that as our creaturely identity, that humans are fully human insofar as they take on that calling to exist for the flourishing of the community around them. And we really recognize that the community around us is not just human, but the more than human, or the non-human community of plants and animals and soil organisms. Then I think that really resonates with this tending the wild approach to ecosystem restoration, to watershed restoration, etc. Another thing I think might be the challenge of trying to think about the biblical call to resurrection and to resistance to death-dealing powers. To think about that alongside of learning about soil biology and learning that life springs from decay, life springs from decomposition. And perhaps the most important thing that I've learned about that is to relinquish the sort of need for certitude or an answer, and to be able to inhabit these two disciplines at the same time, to really think theologically about the world and engage the world from the posture of discipleship commitment, while also trying to submit to some of the most practical and real insights of scientific ecology, and to not let one bully the other around, but actually to let them crash into each other, those two conversations, and really begin to see how the death and decay that exists within a compost pile is something that is part of shalom. I think. So.
Both of you have considerable experience working within and among Protestant evangelicalism. And this is a stretch for most folks in those communities. They might not see the relevance of spending 17 days learning the art of permaculture as having much at all to do with discipleship or faith. And yet we have a variety of people here who have set aside huge amounts of time in their life to do just that. And all of you are going to be asked when you get home, you did what? And why did you do that? How would each of you go about explaining why this is so important to the integrity of faith in this historical moment? I know you both had to give that elevator speech a few thousand times, but I want you to give it on the webinar.
Well, I'm a Bible geek, so that's where I begin. And that's actually a good place to begin with evangelicals, if you're trying to convince them. I think we're at a point in history where the church needs to re-inhabit both the places in which Christians find themselves, but also our narrative, our biblical story. We're at a point where that story is something that we don't know anymore. And the church, as a result, is inhabiting other stories. Most obviously, the story of Western progress and the story that we are fed about the development of a consumer society and the ongoing development of the earth and everything that ties in with this forward march of progress and civilization. And in that kind of a context, it's incredibly important to remember that we live out of a different narrative. And that's a story where the world is given to us as gift. And that wonderful creation that is given to us as gift in Genesis 1 is one which we are called to tend and to keep. We are called to be the ones who ensure the ongoing abundance and flourishing of creation, which is not the narrative of our culture. So this is what we've been doing these last 2 weeks, has been exploring that story, seeing how our creaturely calling unfolds as the story goes on, how the law calls us to care for the earth, and how Jesus shows us what it is to care for the earth, and what the prophets tell us about caring for the earth. And caring for the earth is tied in with caring for all of the community that we find ourselves in, because the earth is connected to all people and all communities. As part of life. So, and of course that story ends with the new heaven and the new earth, where God comes to make God's home with us on the earth. Because the whole point is that the earth was the place where God wanted to hang out with us. I have a bumper sticker that says, God's original plan was to hang out in a garden with some naked vegetarians. And that's kind of what it was about. That's what God wanted to do. And when we get to the end of the story, well, I guess we've got clothes on by that point, but God still wants to hang out with us on this earth, and we are the earth creatures. So becoming aware of that biblical story, rooting ourselves in that story, shows us the importance of getting to know the land, getting to know creation, finding our place in creation and what it looks like. And that's what this whole course has been about. This is what Chris has been teaching us these weeks, is what are the patterns of relationship that give rise to flourishing life in the world.
Chris, you were a pastor of a church that included a number of homeless folk, and now you're a permaculturist. And have you just become a tree hugger?
Well, in some ways, yes, I guess I'm definitely a tree hugger, but yeah, I got into permaculture partially because I woke up to the realization that I didn't know how to do anything, and that in many ways I was a kind of a liability to my community, and it was a community that I was looking to be of some use to. But then as we grew in intimacy with our neighbors and the work that we were doing in the city, I increasingly was seeing the connections between social problems, ecological problems, our individual and inner problems, the work that we need to do to heal from trauma, abuse, and, for example, just the kind of the living in the banal environment of some city neighborhoods where you're living paycheck to paycheck. That does a tremendous amount of damage to us inside, you know, and who we are, and we have the wonder sucked out of us. And to begin to invite people into a garden, into an urban orchard, out to walk along a stream is sometimes one of the most healing things for somebody living in that kind of a context. And so yeah, I think it was making the connections and realizing that to engage in the work of permaculture design is not to abandon the commitments that I had in urban and pastoral ministry, but to take them and root them in a specific constellation of practices. And my pastoral orientation still finds an avenue to be exercised even in the work that I do now. So, yeah.
We're about halfway through our time, and so I want to say a couple of things to the audience. You're going to have an opportunity to chat questions to Sylvia and Chris. I also want to say to our classmates that I want to call several of you up to just give a testimony to how you are experiencing this course. And I'm going to privilege those of you whose spouses are on this webinar so they can actually see you and hear you for a minute. But I want to ask our audience on the webinar to be thinking of questions you might want to ask Sylvia or Chris. And for that matter, if any of you, as I call you up, have a question you've been dying to ask Sylvia or Chris, you could just do it right here, because this is a glimpse into this course, and we're just carrying on, going about our work. I think one of the first people to sign up on this webinar was Jeremy's wife, Kim. So Jeremy, I want to call you up and have you say a word or two. Say a word or two about, if you don't mind being the popcorn there on the end. Word or two about your context, where you're coming from, and a word or two about what you're gaining so far from this course, and a word or two of affection for your wife.
Well, I'll start off with the affection. I love you, and I miss you, and I am excited to get back to you and my family. And I thank you for making the sacrifice to allow me to come here and learn all of this. I'd like to share that I feel like I'm learning a lot. Chris is a great teacher, and I'm thankful for that. He's teaching how to do things properly and how to not rush into bad decisions just to practice permaculture. And I really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to getting home and planning, making good decisions, and applying these things correctly to just to be efficient and lessen the carbon footprint and stop wasting space, conserve water in some very practical ways. And I like it that that what I'm learning is that it can be applied slowly and carefully and correctly, and it can be a slow transition. And I know that makes it a lot easier for many people to step into it. It doesn't have to be a a huge shift. And so, yeah, and I like that, and I'm looking forward to learning some more. So,
Do you want to just say a word about your own little farming venture there in Fresno?
Well, my wife and I have a urban farm in Fresno where we have been growing our produce in our backyard and holding a once a month farm stand on our front porch. Our goal was we live in a food desert and we wanted to be able to make produce available walking distance for people in our neighborhood. And I want to get better at that, and I would love to teach other people how to do the same thing.
Thank you. Zach, you want to come up and say hi to your folks and tell us a little bit about your journey and what you're learning here at the Permaculture Design course. Thanks, Jeremy. That was lovely. Where are your folks tuning in from, dude?
I think they're in Columbus, Ohio. And I have some friends in Elkhart who are probably on somewhere as well. So shout out to you all. Oh, my context. Yeah, my context right now is pretty mobile. With me and Julia are still trying to find our place. So I think it's been both frustrating and exciting to be learning this information without a real land base in mind. But we're both deeply committed to finding that place for us to finally root. And I'm already looking for the next permaculture course to take. So I'm very on fire for this stuff and the way that it's teaching me more about theology in the Bible as well. So.
You've been nodding your head so vigorously at some points in the course, I was afraid it was going to fall off. What are a couple of things that you're really geeking out about?
Oh, I think the non-domination approach to the land. I think our permaculture starts by observing and learning before acting, learning from the land and listening to the land. And I find that very reminiscent to Jesus being led out to the wilderness before he began his public ministry, and learning from the wild animals, the flora, the fauna, being tempted, and getting to know his place, his context, and yeah, that really gets me going. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. All right. Come on up. Miriam is our border specialist, and she and her husband are Presbyterian missionaries at the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona. Welcome, Miriam, and say a word about the work that you and Mark do as missionaries on the border and how that relates to why you're here.
Hi again. Yeah, we are located on the border with Douglas, Arizona, and Nuevo Prieta, Sonora. We are Presbyterian missionaries with the Presbyterian Church. And forgive me first than anything, because I'm in the process of learning English. So these folks over here are been great teachers to me, and also the whole group, which I appreciate it very much. We have a ministry of, that is actually one of the 6 ministries that we have on the border, and we work with partnership with other programs in the Mexico side. And one of the family ministry is that is evangelizing through children in the community, but also having a community garden and where the community can come and actually have a piece of a little land to where they can grow their food. We are searching ways that we can be there as to support this community. There is is located in one of the areas, the poorest area of the city, of the population of 1,000. And we are looking for ways how to grow sustainable food that actually the community will learn in a way that is not only for one season or for one harvesting period, but through the whole year where they can actually be harvested and eating from the garden. And this place over here, I have found it very deep, transform in natural way, a spiritual way also. And this is my the passion that Chris is actually sharing and giving and contagious, contagiando, contagious, about the passion for the nature and how we should be, as human, as God's creator, be treating and in a way that it doesn't hurt anything to the nature that we do.
We're so glad that you're part of this circle, Miriam. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing what you're going to do there with those gardens along those arroyos. Thank you. Okay, let's. I want to call up one more person whose spouse is out there in Radio Land. John McRae has come to us typically in a permaculture design course. The lead teacher will invite colleagues to come in and teach different parts of it. Colin Richard, who's on this webinar tonight, was here over the weekend doing some work with us. He's a permaculturist down in San Diego. Thanks for tuning in, Colin, and thanks for being up here over the weekend. John McRae came to us from Harrisonburg, Virginia, also a graduate of a permaculture design course and a working permaculturist. John, welcome. And yesterday you were talking about some ways in which permaculture is resonant with restorative justice, which is a field that you've done quite a bit of graduate study in. Do you want to talk a little bit about restorative justice in permaculture?
Yeah.
And say hi to your wife?
Yeah, hi, Rochelle. Restorative justice, according to folks like Howard Zare, would say that it's trying to reframe the way we understand our relationships with other people, and that we are interconnected. We don't just exist as isolated individuals. And so crime or injustice or harm is not just a violation against the state, it's the cause and the effect of damaged relationships. And so how can we use that understanding of a harm or injustice to understand the way that we've been relating to our landscapes and to our watersheds? And so restorative justice is predicated on questions, on asking about these relationships, that in the event of a traumatic injustice or harm, who has been hurt and what are their needs? Whose obligation is it to meet those needs? Who needs to be included? Who else has been affected in the community and in surrounding groups? And then what's an appropriate process in which everyone can participate to decide what needs to be done? And those are questions that a permaculture designer needs to ask as well when they approach a landscape or a watershed, to look at the effects. What has been done here? What has been harmed? What trauma is the landscape or the watershed experiencing? And whose obligation is it to do something about it? And what kind of process do we need to imagine in order to respond to this in a creative and regenerative way? You also, we had a really interesting session yesterday
trying to look at the overlap between permaculture principles and the work many of us do in what we call Sabbath economics. Do you want to say just a word about economic justice and how permaculture relates to that?
Yeah. Well, if we look at the design principles of permaculture, it's envisioning a system in which there is no waste, in which the solutions are small and a little bit slower so that we can see the effects of and the consequences of our actions. Our actions always have consequences. And if we envision a system that is smaller in scale in which a feedback loop is closed, we can more easily see the effects of our actions. And our economic system as it now exists does not allow for that to happen, where we externalize the cost, the labor, and the resources, outsourcing everything. And so permaculture is one way out of many to understand an economy within ecology. The ecology is at the base. This is the study of the household in Greek. Economy is how we care for and tend to that household. And it needs to be done within the limits and the possibilities of that household. And so we need to think about resilience and regeneration. Resilience as bending but not breaking, as stability and adaptation, whereas regeneration is about transformation and about renewing and about decay becoming life, and that needs to be an economic principle as well.
Perhaps you could say a quick word about New Community Project, where you're based.
Yeah.
And some of the work you do there.
Yeah. I work, as well as living on a small homestead, I work with a group called New Community Project based in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where we're trying to work at several areas that we see high impact from human settlement, and that's on food, transportation, and the built environment, as well as in our social relationships that affect all those things and are affected by them. And so New Community Project is an education center and a demonstration site for permaculture and community building. It's a supportive home of hospitality for friends who have struggled with difficult life circumstances, and it's also a project incubator for hatching local action for justice and resilience with churches and schools and our neighbors, our Hispanic neighbors, Congolese refugee neighbors who want to start farming near us in order to provide food security for their friends and African American communities nearby.
Jeremy and I were just wondering, and this is actually a question to either of you, do you have to have a beard to be a permaculturist?
Yeah.
Wow, great.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Got it going on.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks.
Jean, can I call you up to the hot seat? Jean comes to us from really one of our sister communities in the radical discipleship movement, the Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., and there she's a resident on Dayspring Farm, and I'd like you to just locate yourself and where you are, and then I want to ask you a question about the collaboration that Dayspring is doing with Chris and company.
Yeah, I went to be a part of the Church of the Savior community about 6 years ago, and recently have become part of the Dayspring Church, and am their outreach coordinator there. So I've been really excited to learn more about their ministries and tell the world about them. They've been influential for quite some time, and it's time for a new generation of people to embrace the radical discipleship that Gordon Cosby started 60 years ago.
One of the issues facing the Church of the Savior as perhaps the oldest experiment in alternative church in the United States is that you're now struggling to move from first generation to second generation to third generation inhabitants of Church of the Savior, and you've got a lot of folk in that community who are older than you, and there's a lot of folk rising now in a younger generation who are really interested in some of those experiments. So your community, Dayspring, has been in a long conversation with Chris and his partner Melissa and others about the possibility of doing some permaculture experimentation on the land at Dayspring. Do you want to say a word about that, or maybe even ask Chris a question about that? But I know that's one of the reasons that brought you here.
And let me say one other thing, and that is Dayspring Church currently has continued to have a thriving ministry that's about listening deeply to God. And as you come away onto this 200 acre piece of land. And so there's the silent retreat ministry, and then there's also a small earth ministry that's been teaching about faith and ecology for over 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a small permaculture site, greenhouse, solar cottages. So the ministry that Chris is envisioning and is teaching about is already there in a small way. And now we're looking at different ways of living into that vision. And so it's been wonderful to have Chris come and begin to be a part of our conversation in our community around a 1 to 2 acre market garden. So Chris, do you want to say something about that?
Sure. Well, yeah, the 1 to 2 acre market garden is the first step in a larger journey together. We've decided to spend basically the next 2 years developing a plan in conversation with the members of Dayspring Church and other folks involved at Church of the Savior, in just rethinking from a number of angles a variety of possibilities for the entire 200 acres. And it'll be not a finalized singular master plan, but it'll be a compendium of design possibilities that the community could go in depending on how it grows or changes over the next few years. And this 1 to 2 acre market garden is not going to be your average market garden. It's going to be an annual vegetable production garden with a food justice emphasis, alternative economics emphasis, and then from the ecological perspective, the annual vegetable production will be carefully and harmoniously nested within the wild ecologies that surround it, and even designing into and around the garden extensive beneficial bird, bat, amphibian, and even some mammal habitat. So trying to pull that off while not having all the vegetables eaten by the critters should be a fun time together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're really delighted that you're here representing that great tradition that you bring with you. And
yeah, it's a gift.
Yeah, knitting together from coast to coast.
Yeah, I'm deeply grateful to be here and learning from Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. We've got some questions piling up, but I want to call one more person up here briefly, if I can get his attention. He's studying his camera right now, just so you can try to work out his accent. Chris, the other Chris, this is Chris White from Melbourne, Australia, and Chris is our neighbor, along with John and Raquel, in Oakview, and is put in a lot of work into making this this institute happen. He's also participating in the course, and you're trained as an architect, and so the issues of design have always been very important to you. How has permaculture course resonating with your training as an architect, and maybe challenging it some too?
Yeah, resonating probably discordantly, I would say.
Okay.
If you get that, it's. I can actually remember my first architecture lecture, and it starts with a picture of an ancient temple depicted as trees growing up and together. Mm. But in some way, that's almost when architecture leaves nature and natural things. It's always referred back to and represented, but often architecture is, let's split this landscape open and impose our beautiful edifice, our monument to our greatness and our awesomeness. And interesting, the theological stuff, particularly with the Tower of Babel being such a representation of progress and being an architectural icon, you know, the ziggurats of ancient times. So the design stuff really appeals to me, because I believe that through being trained and learning how to design something, it helps you to be a better designer. Like my housemates are all artists, and we know that through practice and training, we become better artists. Some people are great naturally, but even the greats train and practice their craft. And for me, the interesting thing about permaculture that perhaps does align with architecture is actually a broad discipline. It considers human habitation and needs. It's not just about putting up straight walls and roofs. And I'm really resonating that permaculture is talking about it's not just gardening, and it's really good that it's not just how to have a nice garden that's ecologically friendly or something like that. It's much broader than that. So I guess maybe that aspect resonates reasonably well with that. But the idea of it being a design discipline, the first words of Chris's explanation really does resonate, because and I guess the counter to that also is it's not about having a bag of tricks that you can pull out like a magician and go, boom, I've got permaculture. It's not what it's about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Sylvia, why don't you come back up? And Tim, what do we got going on there? Thank you, Chris.
First question from Brian Walsh. I'll just read it as we go.
Oh, are we going to get into a marital thing happening here, or what? This is Sylvia's partner tuning in.
On the biblical narrative behind you, I can read as far as the exile. I can't see if you've ever talked about wisdom literature, so I'm going to turn the camera so Brian can see the rest.
It's about 2 miles long, Brian.
So Brian and I can get the broader view. Can't see if you ever talked about wisdom literature, but it seems to me that the very principles of permaculture, to attend, to care, to notice closely, this is what wisdom is all about. Attending closely to the wise ways of the creation. What are the resources available to us in wisdom?
Okay. You should never tell your spouse when you're doing these things. So I put wisdom up there because that's where wisdom would go. If we plotted it onto the biblical story when we put this up, which we didn't. And so this is a great question, because this is something we haven't covered yet in the class. There are all kinds of resources available to us in the text, in the wisdom literature, and different kinds of resources available to us. So, so the end of Job, chapters 38 and following, and actually this has resonated in Psalms like Psalm 104 as well. You get this picture of how intimately God has put creation together, and the place that every part of creation has. So in Psalm 104, you can kind of imagine a farmer maybe sitting on a mountain, the side of the Ojai Valley, looking down into the valley and seeing, farmers tending to their work and a stream coming down, if there had been rain, which there hasn't here, but in ancient Israel there probably was, and the trees growing up by the side of the stream. And then the psalmist talks about who makes their homes in the trees and which animals make their home in the banks of the streams and of the rivers, and where human beings fit in, and who lives in the sea. There's this picture of a well-ordered, harmonious creation where all creatures find a home and have a place. This should give us pause in a world where bits and parts, large swaths of that creation are being destroyed. Who no longer has a home as a result of that? That's one part. The other part is that wisdom in Proverbs is intimately linked with creation. That wisdom was the first creation of God. That wisdom was kind of playing around while God created the world and playing with creation. And the whole of the book of Proverbs is a reflection. A lot of it is a reflection on the permaculture principles of observance, right? Paying attention to what's going on in creation, and you will be wise. And in fact, the book culminates with this lovely poem to the valorous woman, to the wise woman. And it's actually, on the one hand, you kind of read it and think, oh, she's one busy lady. She's got a lot going on. But in a world where an imperial world, the world of Solomon, that's why wisdom's next to Solomon, because this literature came out of the same time, the men were often absent because Solomon had them doing military work, engaged in building his palace and his temple, doing field labor, and that left the women as the ones who were in charge of the household, in charge of the care and affection of the land. And there is this picture of the Israelite household, the woman from the Israelite household who is caring for this household, who is caring for the land, and it's all of a piece. She knows where to find the flax to make clothes. She has the animals that she can shear for the wool. She considers a field and buys it. That's stated very lovely. She considers it. She knows something about this land. Twice it's mentioned that she opens her hands to the needy and looks after the poor. She looks after her household. There's this sense of deep indigenous knowledge that she has about her place. And that knowledge enables her to carry on the care of this place and this household in the face of the imperial forces that surrounded Israel at that time. And there's another place to look at the Song of Songs. And Ellen Davis, in her book, I'll just hold it up here, Scripture, Culture, Agriculture, has this lovely chapter on the Song of Songs as Israel's recollection of the wilderness that is being taken over and that is being industrialized by the imperial economy. And she reads the Song of Songs as this poem to the wilderness and the relationship between wilderness and the city. So I won't say too much more about that because I can't remember the details of the argument, but that's the wisdom literature has so many resources, and I just need to apologize to the class that this has not come up yet, but you've heard it now. So thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Carol in Toronto. Question from a non-farmer. Any suggestions for how to pray before a meal that we know is from a wounded food system? Is there a way to pray before eating a Big Mac?
God help us.
Kyle Vickers is an alumnus of Institute. So Bartimaeus Institute is a place where we all learn to ask smart questions. And this is a good one because, in fact, have a wounded food system. Either of you want to take a crack at that?
We have been singing a prayer here all week, in English and in Spanish. Thank you, Lord, for bread. Give bread to those who are hungry and hunger for justice to those who are fed. Thank you, Lord, for bread, which is an acknowledgement that we eat in a world where many do not have enough. That doesn't quite answer your question because I think it's a deeper question you're asking. Maybe we need to pray with lament before our meals.
I was just thinking prayer as a certain apology that we live in a world where food like this exists and we eat it either through necessity or desire, and that's all part of the brokenness. So yeah, prayer is lament. Any thoughts, Chris? I know it's been a while since you've had one of these hamburgers.
Maranatha is probably the only thing that came to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle.
Tommy Sherman. How might you advise people endeavoring to immerse themselves in a life of is it hard to hear? No. Okay. I'm going to switch this. Is that better? Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. Tommy Sharman, how might you advise people endeavoring to immerse themselves in a life of agri/permaculture as a means of ministry and community building in tackling the questions of income, how to survive in a world dominated by an empire that presses huge costs upon us? I ask this in light of the reality that earning a viable and sustainable income through agriculture in our world is quite difficult, often fluctuating. I'd be interested to hear Chris and Sylvia's stories about how they make ends meet in this regard.
Do we have to switch this back or?
That's fine.
Yeah. All right. So that's a great question from a young man who's not too long out of graduate school, currently working at a university, and we've got a number of folks here in this room who we're trying to figure out, Mark, aren't we? What are we going to do with our lives, and how are we going to sustain that financially? You guys have made choices to pursue your vocation, and that sometimes means a certain amount of marginality and improvisation. Why don't each of you speak to this, because it's a really important question.
Sure. I just turned 30 this year and spent most of my 20s living on under $15,000 a year. And that was quite challenging, but developing skill, experience in permaculture, applied ecology, and living my commitments to justice and reconciliation happened mostly in community and in conversation and partnership with others, in which we were able to do things that we would not have been able to do alone. Rebuilding houses, planting gardens, bartering, skill sharing, etc., etc. So that was a major part of my journey. In the last few years, I realized that a lot of what I feel like I've been called to, was not going to be possible exclusively in that model. And so I started what I like to think of as an alternative business, doing permaculture consultation and design. And that has been slow growing and has taken a long time, I think. From some angles, it's been a relatively short period of time. I think it's been about 5 years of getting to a point where the business is really working for us. But it's a really regenerative approach to running a company, because we are, in many ways, I'm getting money to help people learn to inhabit their watersheds, their ecosystems in ways where they no longer need as much money. And I'm taking that money and converting it into forest gardens and stream restoration, etc., by buying plants and so forth. So it's a way of inhabiting this very challenging economic configuration of reality called capitalism, hopefully in a way that has its own subversion of capitalism built into it. And we could probably talk more about that in another conversation or by email, Tommy. I know I owe you an email.
Well, people sometimes ask us if we farm for a living, to which we usually respond, we don't know anybody who farms for a living. All the farmers we know have at least one family member who works off farm to support the farming habit. And those are conventional farmers in our area. And so farming isn't how we support ourselves. Both Brian and I are academics, and I make a little bit of money doing that. But part of the reason I'm in this permaculture course is precisely to enter the kind of lifestyle that Chris is talking about, to be in a place where it's possible to live with a lot less money capital, and to live a lot more social capital, and to live more with to live more in the community of both the land and the people around us. And I think Chris pointed out something really important, that community is incredibly important if you want to live on the land and with the land. It can only be done in a web of relationships around that piece of land.
Say one more thing. Just one more thing to add. The only people that I do know who make a living from farming are, and I'm sure there are people who do it in industrial methods, but but most people I know who actually are making a viable living, livelihood from farming are using some variation of permaculture methodology and design, where they've designed their business model as a polyculture, for example, and so they're building multiple streams of income and building a kind of resilience to their income streams through their land base. So if people do have access to land, which is often the biggest hurdle in the beginning, but if people do have access to land, whether it's 1 acre, 2 acres, or 200 acres, there is a way of ecologically inhabiting that landscape and also making an income.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks for tuning in. We got Tim.
So, question from Rob. Rob, I'll make a try at your last name. Vander Giesen-Reitzma?
Yep.
All right. Question from the VGR living room. Can you speak to the guidance the New Testament provides for ecological faithfulness? Nice narrow question there.
And perhaps you can substitute for Kirsten, who's not here to say hello to you, Rob.
Rob, I just want you to know how much I love you. I miss you.
Well done.
Actually, that's true. I know, but not the way Kirsten does. Yeah, I could say something about the New Testament. In the Gospels, particularly, make it clear that Jesus was living and teaching in an agrarian context. He was talking to people who lived on the land, who knew about seeds, who knew about workers standing in the marketplace waiting for work in the morning of the day and at the noon of the day. He was writing and talking about people. Jesus wasn't writing, he was talking about people who were storing up a lot of grain in their barns, more than they needed. And in that kind of a context, there are quite a few things that Jesus says about how we treat the land and each other, what kind of servants we are to the land. And this is all tied in with a certain way, an economic way of embodying the world, as Jonathan was saying earlier. So there's an economics of generosity in Jesus' teaching. And that kind of economics is one that's rooted in a certain generosity to the land and to the food that the land produces. So you can't talk about the land without talking about food in an agrarian economy. So when Jesus feeds people, 5,000 people, not including women and children, with these loaves and fishes, this is a reminder to Israel of the abundance of creation, of that giftedness of creation, a reminder of manna in the wilderness and the gift economy that God has set them in the middle of this abundant creation. So that's part of what Jesus does, and there's various teachings, various parables that are tied in with that. We could go into those, but it would go way past the webinar. But this carries on throughout the New Testament. So Paul also practices this abundant generosity, this economics of generosity. But Paul also attunes us to the lament and groaning of creation in Romans chapter 8, and reminds us of the hope that creation has, that human beings will once more be the image bearers, the one who will look after creation. And of course, that points us towards the end of the story in Revelation, where you have a judgment on Babylon in Revelation 18, and that judgment is tied in with all these economic factors. Rome is judged. Babylon is kind of code for Rome. Babylon is judged for the exploitation of the earth, for kind of a globalized economy that brings in food and resources and animals and plants and wood from all parts of the empire, and human beings as slaves. Rome is judged for this. And in contrast, we have this new creation, which is a city that has a river of life running through it with trees on its banks And the fruit of the trees are for the healing. No, sorry, there's fruit for everyone, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. It's a vision of a permaculture city, of a food forest in the middle of this new city. That's what the new earth will look like. So if that's the vision, if that's where our story ends, and if we want to be part of that vision, then what does it look like to live as if we're part of that vision now? To practice that abundant generosity, that economics of gift. And what does it look like to practice that kind of a relationship to the earth, so that when that new earth comes, we are actually at home there. It's our place.
Thank you.
So with Colin's permission, I'm going to skip over his question for now and come back to it if we have time. It's actually for John. And go on to Joseph and Marie Kovich's question. Is there a movement to engage in permaculture in war-torn areas in the world, such as Bosnia or Palestine?
That's John's question.
Oh, that's John's question also.
Yeah.
Come on up, John. Go ahead, sit here. Sit here.
The question is there a movement to use permaculture in conflict-ridden areas? I can't speak to Bosnia, but I was first introduced to permaculture while working in Palestine, where I was doing nonviolent direct action and advocacy journalism, among other things. And there is a growing interest in application of permaculture design principles and the various strategies that come along with those. So for instance, Bustan Karaka, which means the tortoise garden, is right outside of Bethlehem in Beit Sahur. Was started by a bunch of British anarchists and ecologists and local Palestinian farmers to start a grassroots agroecological revolution, is the way they talked about it, in the West Bank, as a way to resist occupation by building local community resilience. 80% of Palestine's depleting groundwater sources are controlled by the state of Israel, and so we need to talk about rainwater harvesting. We need to talk about ways to hold water in the soil longer in a very dry land situation. There's also Marda permaculture farm up near Nablus, most of whose land has been taken by the settlement of Ariel. And this is a small town that was mostly self-resilient in the past, and so now they have a small demonstration farm and education center where they're doing design courses, training local farmers. So this is a completely Palestinian-run operation where small farmers are coming in, looking at the examples that are being done in that place, and then this farm is helping them implement that in the areas around them. There are other examples in Guatemala, in Africa, and in Colombia. Yeah, this is, and there's a PhD student who recently graduated from George Mason University with a PhD in conflict resolution. She did her dissertation on permaculture as peace building in, I think, Costa Rica, where she was looking at the conflict transformation approach of John Paul Lederach and the permaculture design principles and what was happening on the ground there. So yes.
All right. Tom Bentley says, I just finished a PDC, permaculture design course, in the Santa Cruz area of California. Farm worker justice was never mentioned. Any thoughts? And he also goes on to say, I read in, I think, Soil and Sacrament, when Bob Ekblad from Tierra Nueva said that something along the lines of a movement should be led by those most affected by the current system, i.e. our food system and farm workers.
Could you read that part about Bob Ekblad again?
Yeah. Bob Ekblad, Tom is citing Bob Ekblad from Tierra Nueva, saying that a movement should be led by those most affected by the current system, for example, our food system and farm workers.
I want to speak to that first. We know the folks at Tierra Nueva and Bob Ekblad, and they're doing a wonderful thing up there, and we commend the experiment that they are doing up in the Skagit Valley in Washington, working in the jails, working with farm workers, doing theological education, doing organizing. I'm mid-dinner here, excuse me. On Saturday, the last full day of this PDC, we will be joining with our partners at the Abundant Table Farm Project to co-sponsor a conference. Sylvia will be giving a keynote and Chris will be responding. That is going to be a bilingual conversation with farm worker families in our farm worker project called Community Roots Garden. This has been a matter of, the question Tom raises has been a matter of considerable discussion with friends at the Abundant Table, because we are, we agree with that perspective that too much of the agrarian philosophizing is being done from a very privileged position without any real grounding apparently or experience with the underside of the agricultural system. And so the voices of farm workers are exceedingly important, and immigrant justice and human rights and wage justice and farm worker housing, health and safety, pesticides in the fields, all of those issues are issues that an agrarian theology and a permaculture practice must put at the center. He discovered that that's often not the case. And we are really committed to, as people of faith, really coming out of justice movements to really insisting on the integration of those issues and those voices, so that this doesn't become an exercise in class privilege. So that's a great thing to raise, and that's exactly what we're going to tackle on the last day of this PDC with friends at Community Roots Garden. And the lead field worker from the Abundant Table Garden is going to talk about her work. Miriam is going to talk about her work at the border, and we hope it's going to be a really rich conversation across the often vast spaces of class and race. I don't know if you guys want to respond, but I also know there's another question for Jonathan coming up.
Yeah,
he actually already answered that one, so there's two remaining. Okay.
Just in planning for this PDC, we talked a lot about that being a problem in a lot of parts and corners of the permaculture movement, and so we really tried to design the curriculum to thoroughly be about intersectionality, the connections between social injustice and ecological degradation, and what is the constellation of practices that we can engage in that traverses that landscape of pain and participates in its restoration. So, yeah. Next question.
All right, there's a shorter one and then a big one. Which one do you want first? All right, let's go with the big one. Ben, we'll come back to yours to finish this off. Stephen Johnson says, "It seems to me that we will never solve the really big problems until we can change the way land and productive resources are allocated, which will require collective action, massive resistance, non-cooperation with the police state, etc. But people need visible precedents, even within the current system, to point suggestively toward what we might do differently with land if it were allocated democratically for sustainable uses. Do you think that there is hope that the current stage of visible demonstrations that are limited and throttled by the realities of a hostile, mainstream capitalist outside economy might give way, like a subsequent wave of ecological succession, to a new wave of collective action to bring land and resources under sustainable bioregional/local management on a massive, though decentralized scale?"
That was the short question.
That was the big one.
That was...
If I followed correctly, then I would say, yes, I have hope, but I certainly wouldn't want you to confuse that with optimism. That's my answer. Sorry,
Chris.
Sorry if that's disappointing, but we could have maybe a correspondence, a written correspondence about that.
Tim, let me draft John, you just say something about the bioregional vision as an alternative politics.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that addresses the question.
We've been trying to integrate permaculture within a framework of bioregionalism or bioregional practices, and a bioregion is a legitimate way of talking about geographic places. It's a mosaic of patterns like watersheds and landforms and soil and vegetation, which should be large enough for self-resilience. We need to talk about a size that makes sense for people to live in, but is small enough for a radical democratic participation where the people who live there have some control and say over their own lives and what happens to them. And there are movements and examples of people doing this, and this connects to the last question about farm worker justice and immigration, is La Via Campesina, which is the world's largest social movement that represents over 200 million farmers, fisher folk, pastoralists, landless people, migrant workers, that is working at a huge intersection of issues such as biodiversity preservation, water rights, women's solidarity, agrarian land reform, asking the big questions about who is controlling the land and who's owning these systems. And they have proposed a phrase to encapsulate a lot of this called food sovereignty, which is the right of a people to decide culturally appropriate and ecologically sound food systems. And it shifts the attention from those who own the land to those who produce, distribute, and consume the food. And that's something that Wendell Berry talks about too, is he has tried to make more explicit recently that agrarianism is not about who owns the land, it's about who cares for the land. And that means the new slavery system, which is the language that he uses for the way that we are treating landless people who are being forced out through our economic policies. So there are those movements out there, and it's the largest social movement in the world working at these issues.
Thank you. And Steve does go on to mention this issue of buying the land.
Mm-hmm.
Follow-up comment here. Who owns it?
Got time for one more question.
One more question, and that is from Ben B. Can you name any resources that speak to the church and re-inhabiting our narrative as you referenced earlier? I think that might be these.
Oh, any resources on re-inhabiting our narrative? Actually, this book that I mentioned by Ellen Davis, Scripture, Culture, Agriculture, is a book that helps us to re-inhabit the biblical narrative as an agrarian reading of the text. There's a book I wrote with my husband Brian Walsh called Colossians Remixed, which is about re-inhabiting that narrative, particularly in the face of empire. There's Norman Wurzba's book, The Paradise of God, which works with these themes and is also very, very good on the biblical narrative as a basis for our life and work. Anything by Walter Brueggemann is excellent. Interestingly enough, there's a New Testament scholar, Rita Halteman Finger, who doesn't focus on agrarian issues, but actually she has two books, one on Romans, one on Corinthians, and both of them are studies in entering the story as if you were part of that story in the first century. And they're set up as books that you actually live out a character in the story as you go through the book, which is a very concrete way to inhabit, a very rooted way to inhabit the narrative as of Paul's letters, which we don't normally think of as narratives, but which are. There's probably some others that I'm missing. I don't know if you guys, anything comes to mind.
One of the books that really does a good job at connecting, that engages the biblical text deeply and is really engaging this issue of the intersecting issues of social and ecological pain, and what discipleship commitment looks like in response to it is Ched's book, Who Will Roll Away the Stone. That was huge for myself. And then there's a recent book that wouldn't appear to engage these issues, but does quite well, which I think is called The Christian Imagination by Willie Jennings, who's at Duke Divinity School. But he really engages the questions of race and place quite well.
And actually, I can mention two others, books that focus on the issue of place. One is by Ched with Matthew Colwell, Our God is Undocumented, which is a very important book. And the other is a book called Beyond Homelessness by Brian Walsh and Steve Baumer-Prediger, which explores place ecologically, in a postmodern context, theologically, geographically, just from all kinds of different perspectives.
Who wrote Longing for Running Water or Longing for Living Water? Ecofeminist? I can't remember.
Oh, even Guevara.
Oh, yeah, Yvonne Gabarra, she's good too, yeah.
I just wanted to add in there, I wanted to add in here the forthcoming resources, a curriculum for study groups and churches from Mennonite Creation Care Network, and they anticipate it being ready in time for summer studies. So I'm looking forward to hopefully facilitating that here at Ojai Valley Community Church. And that will, as I understand it, be incorporating the understandings of watershed discipleship and the story of living into place. So we look forward to that as well.
Thank you, Shirley. That's a good word. Mennonite Creation Care Network are partners of ours, and they've been working really hard on that curriculum. Thanks for reminding us of that. We want to thank you all for tuning in. Tim, if you would change slides and put up the next one, great. We do want to remind you that our next webinar is June 10th. Is that right? Tuesday, yes. June 10th.
5:45.
And we encourage you to tune in and tell your friends that we're going to be going back to the discipline of Bible study. And we're going to be celebrating Pentecost by looking at the resonances and dissonances between the Tower of Babel story and the Pentecost story as stories that both affirm multicultural insurgency and diversity as a form of resistance to empire. So join us for that and keep your Bibles handy. We hope we'll see you. Please help us spread the word. We rely on your word of mouth to build our listenership. Thanks very much for tuning in. Any last word, Sylvia, Chris, you want to say?
Well, since I told Rob I loved him and missed him, I should probably tell Brian that I love him and I miss him too.
Good call.
That might be a good call, yeah.
Chris?
It's good to be here with you.
We are really grateful that you decided to drop in and get a little bit of a glimpse into this permaculture design course. It will be concluding this coming Sunday, and I know all of the participants join us in thanking you for dropping into our classroom tonight. Please be mindful that this is a very, very important movement, a movement that not only seeks to renew culture and land, but has the potential also to help renew our churches. So thanks to Chris and Sylvia and all of the participants, and we're going to sign off and, as usual, let folks chat their greetings to each other. Thanks very much for joining us, and thanks Tim Nassiger for running the show as usual.